The readings of today remind me very much of a trek up Mount Ugu, almost 26 years ago, just a few months before I went to Rome for further studies. I was invited by the Pal Mountaineering Club and the Ayala Mountaineers to celebrate Mass with them atop the peak where 3 years earlier, a Pal turboprop plane had crashed. I reached the peak with the group all right, but with much difficulty. By then, my full-time work, that is, being acting parish priest where I was just 2 years ago, and all the teaching job I was concurrently doing, after wrapping up my stint in our college in Mandaluyong City as dean, all contributed to my being out of shape, not to mention the fact that by then, I had a queasy tummy that for days kept me running, if you know what I mean. The whole climb was a torture and an absolute struggle. It was embarrassing to the group as I had to stall them or delay their ordinarily fast pace of ascent. The stunningly beautiful vistas of pine forests and deep gorges and ravines and everything exciting that is related to the climb went unnoticed and unappreciated as far as I was concerned. Being there atop the ceiling of the Cordilleras of northern Luzon meant nothing to me as I was in the thick of the struggle. But what egged me on and urged me to go on was the vision of what was coming up ahead, with a lot of help from very understanding individuals who made up the group. They were my cloud of witnesses, to use the same word used by the letter writer to the Hebrews. I hadn't quite gotten yet into the 8th year of my priesthood then, but as early as then I knew and had first-hand experience that life was more than just a trek up beautiful mountains. That life was not exactly like a box of chocolates, as the famous Forrest Gump would say a few years later. Life, as our readings tell us today, in no uncertain terms, is a struggle of heroic proportions. And Jeremiah's story is more than just a case in point. He did good, he obeyed God, albeit reluctantly at first, but all he got in return, at least temporarily, was a lot of rejection and persecution. Today's passage stands witness to that persecution, to that struggle that every good man who tries to be good and do good is ineluctably subjected to. In an earlier homily, I had the privilege of sharing with you in broad strokes my own cistern experience of rejection, that the book of Jeremiah could only describe thus: there was no water in the cistern, only mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud. That's from the first reading. My teacher, Dr. Robert Wicks, had a better way of putting into words that experience of mine as what he called a bewildering slide into darkness. Scott Peck's first book captures what I'm trying to say. The thesis of that first book is simply stated as follows: this, life is difficult. I know better, now that I'm older, than to belabor what is so obvious to all my readers and hearers. Life is a struggle. Incidentally, Scott Peck's second book builds up further on that original thesis. There he says simply, life is complex. To deny one or the other or both, depending on the intensity, would then qualify as either neurosis or psychosis. But it is when one is in the cistern of muddy confusion and disappointment that one learns to cry, as did the psalmist, Lord, come to my aid. The Lord does come to my aid. The Lord did come to my aid in that struggle of a trek. I reached the peak. I reached the star of our common endeavor. I was able to say Mass in suffrage of the souls of those who perished in that crash, lending truth to that Latin saying that at that time I only held on to conceptually, ad astra per aspera, to the stars through toil, The Lord has come to our aid. He does so by surrounding us with so great a cloud of witnesses. How true indeed. I grew up knowing more or less closely two very great popes, Paul VI and John Paul II. Incidentally, it dawned on me that most of my priestly life so far was under John Paul II's pontificate. My readings of the turbulent times immediately after Vatican II tell me how much Paul VI had suffered. His suffering, truth be told, came from right within the Church, from the very people who should have stood up for him and supported him. It is no secret, too, that Pope St. John Paul II also suffered terribly, especially in the last years of his life. But despite all the speculations that both would resign, they both held on with perseverance and faith, as if to proclaim with their lives what the letter to the Hebrews exhorts us all to. Let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, and persevere in running the race that lies before us while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of truth. The Lord does come to our aid. He does so in the person of Jesus, his Son, who passed through sweat and care and cumber sorrows passing number. This same Jesus now tells us, struggling humanity, I have come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. My struggle to reach the peak of Mount Ugu is nothing more than a pale comparison to what the cloud of witnesses that I referred to above really had to undergo. There is more to the list. I have not mentioned countless others who braved through all imaginable forms of problems and strife and came out of the struggle stronger and more convinced of their faith, hope, and love for the Lord. Even my own struggles beyond Ugu, the bewildering slide into darkness that I referred to above and elsewhere in my blogs and writings, are nothing compared to what others have suffered and still are suffering from. I am shamed by so much that so many others have to put up with every day just to follow the Lord and proclaim His Lordship in all the earth. There are so many other Ugu experiences that I have gone through. Some worse, some less, but all of them difficult and unpleasant. Whilst I feel no need to pick a quarrel with Forrest Gump and his disarming simplicity, I take exception to the first part of that line that made him popular and quotable. Life is like a box of chocolates. But the second part is something I subscribe to. You never know what you're gonna get. There is one thing I do know for sure, however. God wants us to go beyond pain, to go beyond difficulty. He has come to make us follow Him beyond Calvary. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. The gospel story does not end in Calvary. It ends with the resurrection and ascension. He has come to raise up too, to lift us up. In my ongoing struggle, I find a lot of solace in the parable of the Lord, where an individual invited to a party chooses to sit at the lowest place, uncomplaining, unassuming, and unhesitating. The master of the house comes and sees him and tells him, Amice, ascende superius. Come on up, my friend, to a higher place. And this, my dear friends, is your Kalakbay at Katoto in this week's episode of Puso sa Puso. A blessed Sunday, everybody.